Hi guys, it's Brooke here. I have a super quick favor to ask. When you have a moment, please take just a second to give this podcast a 5-star review. This will help me to continue the podcast and continue to bring these resources to the community. Thank you so much for that 5-star review.
And if you're a listener today, have you ever noticed that if you're talking to someone and they look away from you and they look at something, that you automatically look at what they're looking at because you're following their eye gaze?
Yeah.
And the other piece of it that is so critically important is referencing for emotional connection. We reference to celebrate all kinds of things in life. A typical one is like a high five when you're referencing that, you accomplished something together. But there are all kinds of things that you stop and reference the person and just to celebrate whatever it is you might be talking about or sharing. And that emotional connection is such a basic human need and just human opportunity.
Hey there, it's Brooke, and welcome to Finding Hope on the Spectrum, where I have heart-to-heart conversations with parents, professionals, and autistic individuals sharing personal insight and life experiences. Together, we dive deep into supports, programs, and stories that offer inspiration, insight, and most importantly, hope for the neurodiverse community. Before we begin with today's topic, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. And if you know someone who this would be helpful for, please pass it along. Remember to always stay curious, be kind, and have an open heart. All right, I have been looking forward to having this conversation with you, Gail, and I'm so excited to just touch base and chat about referencing. It's such an important topic, and this is going to be part 2 of our 3-part series. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand what this is, to understand why it's important to work on, and that it can be worked on. And we see it time and time again with our clients. So I just can't wait to dive deep into this topic of social referencing and what it is and how we work on it in our RDI programs and at TAG as well. And I'm going to go ahead and read your bio, Gail, and for those that may not have listened to our other episodes, and then we'll get started. So Gail Ludwig is an RDI program certified consultant and a licensed speech language pathologist. Graduating with a master's in speech pathology in 1982, she has been a practicing speech language pathologist for over 40 years. She received her RDI certification in 2008. Presently, she primarily works as the executive director of RDI services for TAG in San Diego, California. Because of her extensive experience and trainings, she is able to look at clients in a comprehensive way, which considers their communication strengths and challenges, relationship obstacles, and sensory motor functioning. Lastly, she has several years of experience supporting students in their school setting, acting as a consultant to school staff, and supervising school shadows using an RDI approach. Gail is very passionate about her work and has experience with clients of all ages. Her philosophy is based on establishing trusting relationships with her families and supporting them in a way that considers their unique needs. She is a very caring person and works hard at supporting her clients to achieve their maximum potential and have a high quality of life. So welcome, Gail. Welcome back.
Thank you, Brooke. I am also very excited about this topic. It is one of the most important topics in RDI, one of the most important opportunities that we give our clients. And it's just so exciting to talk about.
Yes, I know. And I can't wait to get into kind of the specifics on how we work on referencing and the beauty of it, and that it is possible to see our clients reference each other, their environment, their parents. And we'll go much deeper into that. But I'd love for you to share just a little bit about your background as a speech language pathologist and RDI consultant and what drew you to this work.
Well, when I saw your question, I had to chuckle to myself, Brooke, because I sort of fell into this field, as a young 18-year-old going to the University of Maryland, not knowing what I wanted to do for a career. And I just signed up for teaching. And the very first semester, I took a course that was required for teaching called The Fundamentals of Speech and Hearing. And it was taught by a very enthusiastic teaching assistant. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. And just on a whim, I changed my major. And so that's the path that I was on. And I started to get more serious about it as I took courses, and they were really interesting. And I was really motivated and wound up with I wound up with a Bachelor's of Arts first from the University of Maryland, and then I pursued my master's degree at the University of Northern Iowa and graduated in 1982. And from there, I just, speech pathology is such a wonderful field because there's so much you can do with it. You can go in so many different directions. And so for many years, I focused on the adult population. I worked in hospitals, and it wasn't until I can't remember exactly what year, but well into probably my 20th year, did I start working in a school and it was a high school because that again I was more comfortable with older students because my whole career up to that point I had been working with adults. And I started getting students on my caseload that had a diagnosis of autism and had, lo and behold, goals that were saying things like make eye contact. And I thought to myself, well, this actually fits right into our discussion today. I had no idea how to support a student to make eye contact. And so it was at that time that I found out about Dr. Gutstein and RDI and went to one of his workshops and became interested in becoming a consultant. And actually, the school district did pay for my training, which was really amazing. And then I actually found that I couldn't do the work inside the school as well as I could do it outside of the school because there's certain constraints within a school setting. And that's when I joined TAG, which was, what did we say? Was it like 15 years ago or more?
I think it was more. Yeah. Many years.
19, maybe it was like 19 or 20 years ago. I'm probably getting my years mixed up. It was a long time ago. And it has been an amazing, amazing journey. And probably the high point of my career is being an RDI consultant and supporting families that have children and adult children with autism.
No, I love that. It's so amazing to see how the journey of life and how it unfolds and what it brings and with the path that you're on. And I think I can really resonate with your story of eye contact. And I remember back when I started as well working for ABA companies, and we were working on eye contact, and we would have drills and we would use reinforcements and train the students or the clients to maintain eye contact. And it just wasn't effective. And so we're going to talk today about referencing and why that is so valuable and important to consider over these eye contact drills. I know they're not as common. I don't know who's using them anymore, if they're being used, but they certainly were really popular back in the day and very common. So let's talk about, just to give our listeners a really brief overview of what RDI is, relationship development intervention. Before we get into that, for those that don't know what it is and haven't heard about it before, just go ahead and share just a little bit about what RDI is.
Well, it is traditionally a parent training program. We as RDI consultants guide and train parents so that they can give their children opportunities for social emotional growth each and every day. And so we start out by teaching the fundamentals of RDI, which involves helping them understand changes they can make in their communication, both verbal and nonverbal, the difference between static work, which is really kind of rule-based, I guess, learning statically information versus dynamic growth, which comes from interactions that are more natural and real and authentic. We talk about the guided participation relationship, which is the typical way that children learn from their parents. And in RDI, what we're working towards, our goal is to establish the guided participation relationship with parents who have children with autism, to help parents feel like competent guides and to help children feel competent as apprentices.
I love it. So, and if anybody would like to learn more about RDI programs and our programs at TAG as well, we will have information at the end of this episode on our weekly presentations that Gail offers. And there you can see videos and ask questions, and it's live. It's a fantastic way to learn more. So we'll make sure to include that in our show notes as well. But thank you for sharing that overview. And, one thing that I found that was so profound for me when I was learning about RDI was this idea of referencing. And I remember Dr. Gutstein talking about it at the 2-day conference that I went to. And that was my first time learning about RDI and what it is and referencing too. And I was at that time a ABA supervisors. The BCBA certification wasn't around yet. So we got our masters and we were supervisors at ABA clinics. And I was learning about this idea of referencing. And I remember having this student who was in a preschool setting, and people would consider her, I don't use the word high functioning, but more capable. She didn't have as many challenges. She was very verbal. She was in the preschool setting with minimal support. And I remember after learning about referencing and understanding the value of it, watching her in this preschool classroom, and she was playing at this little joined table that had toys on it with other peers, and she was trying so hard to fit in, and she was looking around, trying to figure out what was going on around her. But I could tell with this new lens of understanding referencing how confused she was actually. And now I understand that she was masking a lot, but that time I had not heard that term before. But now it makes a lot of sense. She was really she had learned to fit in, but she really was confused and not sure how to respond to her peers. And all the little peers were interacting with each other and collaborating, and she wasn't able to. But she was standing there and looked really good, but she really was very confused. And I just remember, I'll never forget that moment. It was kind of a light bulb went off for me on how much was missing. And I felt pretty confident at that time of my understanding of autism and the supports that were needed. And, for most people, they would say this child was very successful, but in that moment, I realized, we were missing quite a bit, and we really needed to hold on to this new knowledge. I did, at least, and really embrace it and learn more. So, and that was kind of the first time I noticed the value of referencing and why it's so important to work on. And I'd love to have you share just a little bit more about kind of your experience with referencing and, what you believe it to be and how you see it play out for your clients.
I guess, most of us are blessed with vision. We can see, and we have vision for a reason. But so many of our clients don't visually take in the environment, and they don't visually connect with the people around them. And that's really what I see referencing is, as visually checking in so that you can gain information and that you can visually connect for so many different reasons. So if we're talking about referencing people, we're referencing them for a variety of reasons. We reference people to check in with them to see if they're paying attention to us. We reference them to see if they're understanding what we're saying, because nonverbally they may show that they're either understanding by nodding or they might show confusion. 80% of our communication is nonverbal. So if you're not checking in with your communication partner, you're missing all of that. People reference for information. Like if you ask a question, you reference somebody and they'll give you the answer. We reference people for, like, kids reference their parents to check in if something is safe for them to do. We reference for approval. I had a video I watched this morning and a family that I want to talk a little bit more about today, where the child referenced his dad and they had just made whipped cream together. And the child said, "Can I dip my finger in the whipped cream?" And he referenced his parent to see if the parent was going to say yes or no.
And they can't, for the listeners that can't see what you just did, because you're modeling it as you're talking about
I'm
it.
sorry, I
You
didn't
know,
realize.
no, I think that, it's so important because it's these subtle things, but your face shifted, we shift your eye, you shift eye gaze, you adjust what you're looking at to gather information. And
Right.
that's
Have
so
you ever
important.
noticed, and if you're a listener today, have you ever noticed that if you're talking to someone and they look away from you and they look at something, that you automatically look at what they're looking at because you're following their eye gaze?
Yeah.
And the other piece of it that is so critically important is referencing for emotional connection. We reference to celebrate all kinds of things in life. A typical one is like a high five when you're referencing that, you accomplished something together. But there are all kinds of things that you stop and reference the person, and just to celebrate whatever it is you might be talking about or sharing. And that emotional connection is such a basic human need and just human opportunity.
Yep. And that's what we talked about last time, is that experience sharing. And after we have that foundation in place, and that would be, if you haven't listened to that episode, that is a great episode to listen to first, because that's the foundation for all of this. And then that leads to the referencing stage and milestones. And as you mentioned, there's so many reasons we reference. And when we're referencing, we are also shifting our eye gaze, as you mentioned. Instead of making eye contact per se, we're shifting, we're monitoring, we're adjusting. It's dynamic, and it's not a static process. It's an in the moment decision that we make. And as a result of our thinking, our actions adjust. And then we process that information. And then we make an adjustment.
Right. It's the shift from objects to people. And I'm sure many of our listeners know that people with autism get very fixated on one thing. That's actually a strength of a person that has autism. They can really focus on one thing, but they don't do as well shifting from that one thing to their communicative partner. So being able to shift from objects to people is a social emotional foundation that happens very early in life.
Yes.
And then
it's so
the
true.
other piece of it is referencing the environment. I always think about that as noticing the environment, because like you were talking about, the girl you were describing was confused because she wasn't referencing her environment. She wasn't able to make sense out of it and understand her place in it and understand how to respond to the people in her environment.
Yes, absolutely. And what's amazing is that, many of our clients will struggle with this in our programs, but they can internalize it. It's not even as much a skill, it's more of an awareness. And they can internalize this awareness and start to do it naturally. And, I was thinking about my client that I've had for 17 years, and she was a guest on one of my episodes. She was the first episode. It's a fantastic episode to listen to if you haven't already. And she mentions in that how she thought I was crazy. Like, he was never going to look at her. He was never going to reference her. That was never going to happen for them. And, he is exceptional at it. And, even, if it feels like it's not ever going to happen or it's not possible, it is so important to not give up hope and to know that it is possible. And it's very manageable to work on. And we're going to talk about some ways that we do that in our program. So I'm so glad that you shared all of those reasons why we reference. And, I think it's important to understand because it is so dynamic and it's complex. It is not necessarily a simple thing, but I'd love to have us kind of bring it to life a little bit more of, with our clients, kind of what happens when we see a client struggle with referencing. What is the impact of that, to begin with, and why it's so important?
Well, it's absolutely huge because they're not connecting. A lot of our clients, when we first start seeing them, they're in sort of a mode of just keeping themselves feeling safe and comfortable. And so, because that's what they have to do to survive life, they don't shift because they're focused on themselves and not the environment around them and not the people in the environment around them. They're often doing special interest activities, or maybe they're seeking sensory input, or maybe they're stimming, which is another form of sensory input, to help them regulate. And so they're missing so much information. They're missing the connection with people. They're missing, like I was saying before, understanding the environment and their place in it. And it is profoundly impactful, profoundly impactful.
Absolutely. And if you're not processing that information, it can be very confusing. What's important to focus on? Why do we focus on these things? And so you're right that we often see these individuals just focusing on making themselves feel comfortable because they can be highly confused about their environment and the interactions around them. And I think that's just a normal response. If anybody feels that level of confusion, they're going to focus on making themselves feel comfortable.
And they have no idea of the value because they've never done it. And when you asked me to come on this show and talk about referencing, I was thinking a lot about this relatively new family that I'm working with, and I've only been working with them for 9 months. And when I first started working with them, the boy, who I think he's about 6, he didn't reference at all, not at all. And he had other therapies that they tried to work on it and it never worked. And I didn't know. I actually thought maybe he needed some biomedical support or something. But it's just been an incredible journey to help him see the value of referencing because they don't know the value because they've never done it.
This show is brought to you by Therapeutic Approach to Growth. Therapeutic Approach to Growth helps families with relationship and behavioral needs. Their holistic programs are individualized to honor and respect each family and their autistic son or daughter's sense of self through programs such as relationship development intervention, naturalistic ABA, and animal-assisted services. If you're finding yourself frustrated or discouraged with your current behavioral programs and would like to see more long-term meaningful growth for you and your family, then contact TAG today at www.tagforgrowth, that's TAGFORGROWTH.com, to learn more about how to schedule a consultation or how they can offer you the help your family needs, whether in person, remotely, or in a school setting. Again, that's www.tagforgrowth.com.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about some kind of the path that you went on with that family and any other family that you have. I know I've seen lots of videos over the years of your clients working on referencing, and I think it would be good to kind of slow that process down and talk about some ways that we focus on it.
This particular client, some of the traditional ways that we do it didn't really work. So, for example, a lot of times what we can do is if we establish a patterned interaction with a child, for example, we have something that we hand to them and then they do something with it, like block building, for example. If we, as the parent, the guide, not necessarily me, the parent hands a block to the child and then the child builds with it, that's a pattern. We call that a complementary sequential pattern. The parent does one thing and the child does something else. A lot of times with that, you can hold back the object, in this case, the block, and wait for the child to reference the parent in anticipation of receiving that block. This child would only look at the block, would not reference the parent. And so even when that parent took the block and put it right up next to their eyes, the child was still looking at the block. And I'm talking about 2 months ago. That child was still looking at the block. So for him, we had to take away all materials. And a lot of times we do have to start with little or no materials so that then that material is no longer a distraction because it's not there. And so for this client, he actually was comfortable just interacting with his parent. So the parent would have him sit on their lap and would make silly faces and silly noises. And that is what kind of woke this child up to, wow, I can get enjoyment at looking at my mom or dad and having them do silly things or make different noises. And that's what started the process of him referencing them.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's such an important part of what you mentioned, that sometimes we have to take the materials away because it's hard, as you mentioned earlier, it's hard for the child to understand what's important to focus on. And so when the materials were there, you know, I would hypothesize that that was the case for that child, and that individual felt that they should be focusing on the blocks, or was just focusing on the blocks and having a harder time understanding the true intention there, you know, of the interaction. And
right. Because what we work on in RDI is we focus on the process of the interaction. It's not about the activity. It's not about the blocks. It's about the parent and child interacting with each other. So we had to, quote, frame activities or plan activities that would give him the opportunity to reference or visually connect with his parents. And in his case, the referencing, almost like for celebration or enjoyment, came before the other types of referencing.
yeah.
And, you know, it's so interesting to think about because I don't really know exactly when it changed. But all of a sudden, this child started referencing more times than you can count. And that's really what mastery is. You know, we can write goals of, oh, the child's going to reference a certain number of times, or the parents are going to give a certain number of opportunities. But when you see a child that starts referencing his parent more times than you can count, that's true mastery. And I got that from Dr. Gutstein.
Yes, absolutely. That's when we know it's really internalized and it's not a challenge anymore. And that's ultimately what we want, is that it just becomes integrated and part of life. And I think that's a testament to why we work with parents as well, because parents can work on these goal areas throughout life, and it can be very natural and authentic, and not, you know, in an isolated therapy session, and that you just have more opportunities to practice that way. And it really does become internalized across settings and people and situations. That's the ultimate goal. So I love that. And so I would imagine now kind of your process would be considering the next steps of referencing and thinking about how to expand referencing for this client to reference in other types of situations, so different reasons why we reference.
Well, and what's so interesting, and this is the beauty of RDI, a lot of the other types of referencing are happening naturally. So this is the same client I was talking about that asked for approval to dip his finger in the whipped cream. And he referenced his dad for approval. We didn't work on that. He just did it.
Yeah.
And now it's so interesting. He still had struggles some with shifting his focus from making the whipped cream, which is what he did with his dad, and, you know, referencing the materials. But then when they finished it, and we're having a conversation about what they were going to do next with the whipped cream, he was referencing his dad without any support. It just happened completely naturally. He would say something and reference his parent.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know that I'm not explaining the entire journey because I'm actually not remembering. It's hard for me to remember the whole journey with this particular client. But
Yeah.
in general, you have to look at what works for the client and the family. Some clients are not ready to sit on the parent's lap and interact in funny ways because that creates too much uncertainty for them. Other clients need that as the first line of support. This client we slowly just evolved to a point where he just started referencing for so many different reasons. I remember when I did an assessment with him, he had to be down on the floor, laying flat on his back to reference for celebrating something we did together.
Yeah.
I think we crashed a bunch of a block tower or something. But he could not shift until he completely disengaged from the materials. So I think that's the exciting, challenging part of RDI is to figure out what works for each individual client.
Yeah. And I think what's so significant about what you shared is that, sometimes we try things and they don't work and we have to make adjustments. And, as you mentioned, you thought maybe there was something biomedically going on for this child. And, you try something different, you make adjustments, and it's all just information. And I think that's such a critical part of it as well, is that, we are here to create opportunities to try them out in a very supportive environment and see if they work. And if they don't, then we make adjustments and we try something else until we figure it out, And I think that is something that parents learn and are able to do for their children and really understand their child and what kinds of supports they need through that process. And I think that's another significant part of the parent involvement. And I know there are other clients that do benefit from materials. I've certainly had some that benefit from using materials to work on referencing and actually probably need those materials to make it a little bit more concrete. So I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the activities that we do for our clients and working on referencing. I know Magic Soup is a really fun one. Everybody loves Magic Soup.
Magic Soup. Right. So Magic Soup, actually, it was called Spice Soup by a consultant that used to work with us. And I feel like I sort of stole it and renamed it Magic Soup. But basically, it's just having a variety of spices and different ingredients from the kitchen. We often include baking soda and vinegar, so we can make kind of like a little chemical reaction, volcano type thing. We include things like food coloring and just basically stir it all into a big bowl. And so the way that we do that activity is that, and this is critical, that the parent has to maintain control over the materials. So they have to have the materials like in a bin or a box or something so that the kids can't just go grab everything. And one material at a time is then handed to the child. But think about this, the pause. And we had another consultant that worked with us that actually found a pause button that she gave to her parents to help them remember the power of the pause. Because when you take that ingredient in your hand and that child is anticipating getting that ingredient from you, you wait until the child references you in anticipation of receiving the item. And then he has the role of putting that item in the bowl. Yes. And maybe also stirring, or you stir. It just depends on how it works out with that child. And so each time there's another ingredient, the parent waits for the child to reference them in anticipation before giving the item to them to add to the Magic Soup.
Yes, I love that activity. Every child loves Magic Soup. I just haven't seen anybody that hasn't enjoyed it. It's so fun to be playful and experiment. And I also love that you can expand it. So, you can really increase the challenge with that activity. And I know kind of the next step after that process that you described, we've oftentimes put a few items out on the table and then looked at the item that was next to add to the bowl and the child references the eye gaze and, that information, and then chooses that item and puts it into the bowl. And so, we can definitely kind of set the stage for that activity and then expand it from there. So, and it's just it's a crowd pleaser.
Definitely, definitely. I'm just trying to think of other activities. There's so many of them. I mean, even making the whipped cream that I watched this morning. What about making ink blots? That's a really fun one too, where I don't know if you listeners know what ink blots are, but basically you're handing the child paint that has like in a squirt bottle that they can squirt on the paper. And so you hand the different colors of paint one at a time. They squirt the paint on the paper. You might fold the paper in half together. And then when you open it, it makes an ink blot. That's a really fun activity too. And then you have the opportunity to celebrate what you made together. So there's two opportunities there. There's referencing in anticipation and referencing for celebration. Something that we haven't talked about yet is referencing for help. And oftentimes we will embed a challenge into an activity like ink blots. Maybe we would hand a child a paint that they couldn't get the top off of easily. And so then they have to reference their parent for help. So many times in traditional programs, and you can speak more about this than I can, maybe ABA programs or other programs where asking for help is a goal, sometimes referencing for help is missed. And in actuality, kids reference in help for help developmentally before they're going to ask for help, because they do that even before they're talking. So we want to make sure to support the child, to give them the opportunity to reference. And of course, then they can ask too, but we want them referencing. We don't want them just looking down at whatever they're doing and saying, help, please, help, please. We want them to make that visual connection with their guide to ask for help.
Yes. There's so much that can be gathered from making that visual connection, of your guide, of your environment. And it's just such a powerful tool and awareness to have that is so important. And, I was just watching a video of one of my clients as you were sharing kind of the lifting of the head and the shifting of the eye gaze as you just demonstrated. And one of my clients is in a classroom setting, and he is in the video, he was writing something on a piece of paper, an assignment, and shifting his eye gaze to the board and then shifting it back to the paper. And, that environmental awareness is so critical. And again, that's another example of something we didn't specifically work on, but because of his understanding of referencing and the value of it, that, this is important, this helps me, I get more information and I understand better, we see this start to organically play out in a variety of different ways, referencing for help.
I'd like to shift. If we could shift to talking about adults for a minute. So I have an adult client that we are working on noticing the environment. Things like noticing if there's a line, being able to notice that you have to go to the end of the line instead of just going to the front of the line. Like when food is served, or if there's a water jug, waiting in line behind people that are getting water. Also, just noticing when somebody's talking to him and being able to respond to that person.
Right.
Noticing, when someone's greeting him. Just noticing people in the environment so that he can respond to those people.
Yeah.
And make adjustment based on the information he's receiving.
Yes.
Such an important area.
It's so important. And as you mentioned earlier in RDI, we work on that dynamic process, dynamic thinking. And all of those examples require that dynamic intelligence, because you really have to reference, you have to notice and make an adjustment based on what you notice. And sometimes you have to adjust again because maybe you got confused, or maybe you misunderstood, or, something happens that's unexpected. And then you have to check in again. And it's just so important that we give our clients these opportunities to be successful in this area. And it made me think of an activity I used to use years ago with one of my adult clients. I had twins, and they had a hard time noticing the environment. And so the parents would spend time at a park and sit on a bench and just share what they noticed and share in that engagement, opportunity to connect and, share their observations. And, it was such a nice way for them to connect, but also work on that concept and that awareness of noticing your environment without the pressure, because they felt, quite pressured often. And so it took them out of that role of having to respond besides just sharing their observation. And, and that's another great way.
The modeling is huge. Yeah. And, that kind of goes back to an early example of RDI where we talk about just experience sharing communication. And instead of, saying, look at that bird, saying, oh, that's a beautiful blue bird. And then the child will reference what you're referencing, and you're modeling noticing something in the environment, and it gives them the invitation is inviting them to also decide to look.
Yes, I love that example. And that's a good example of that declarative communication. And we talked about that on part 1 of our series here as well, and how important that declarative communication is. And I think it's so incredibly important. And the last example I was thinking of was one that you could see if you are able to attend one of the RDI info presentations. I believe we're still sharing this example, but it's an example of a family working on referencing in a grocery store. And, they're picking out bananas and chips and different items in the store, and the mom is visually looking at the one that she wants, and her daughter is referencing her and checking in to see which one she wants and choosing that item. And I remember working on that goal with that family, and we had to start in the home in a more less distracting environment. And, we started in the kitchen when we were going to get items out to make a recipe and choose the right pan for that recipe, things like that. And then we were able to expand it to the grocery store. And that was a big deal for that family because the community was very dysregulating for this child. So to see her being able to work on those goals and those challenges in that environment was quite significant. And, I just loved when they got to that place. It was just so powerful and empowering for her and for her mom to have that experience together.
It's nice for me to hear that background because, yes, I do use that video. I show it every time I do a presentation. And it is really good to know that that was very significant for her to be regulated. And part of the reason she was regulated is because she understood her role, understood her mom's role, and that decreased her uncertainty in the community, in the grocery store.
Yes, so true. She felt very competent. She understood her role within the interaction, and she was able to then be successful with it. And it was quite the successful moment to celebrate for us. And it was so great. And I think we should talk a little bit about scaffolding because we do embed scaffolding into all of our programs. And I want to make sure we touch on that as we're talking about how we make adjustments for our clients. So let's talk about kind of how we see scaffolding. Some people haven't heard that term. Some have that are in the field of education, but let's talk about what scaffolding is and how we use it for referencing.
Well, I just think about it as support and adjusting support and providing the right level of support at the right time. And so basically for something like referencing in for anticipation, if the child isn't referencing, then you're going to increase the support, or that's how you're going to scaffold it. So the parent might take the block and put it right up next to their face to give that child a chance to notice the parent's face and not just the block. Or it could be that the parent touches the child's face to help the child. That tactile physical cue may be enough for the child to reference. So you're just looking to add support as needed to accomplish your goal.
Yeah.
And then reducing that support or reducing the scaffolding when it's no longer needed.
Absolutely. One thing that I love to do with referencing, I find can be helpful, is creating anticipation, creating that anticipatory moment. You might say, ready, set, go, or I'm going to choose that one in a really excited, anticipatory way and pause right before. And that seems to really help draw in that focus and that connection, and curiosity.
The transition words are huge. And that reminds me, that is what we did with this client that I've been telling you about, that made all this progress in such a short time. The transition words really helped him.
Yeah.
And we would vary them so it didn't become static. You taught me that years ago. So instead of always saying 1, 2, 3, we'd say ABC, ready, set, go, here we come. I think about like a pillow fight. Think about having a pillow over your head and saying, ready, set, go. And the kid wait for the child to reference you before you hit him with the pillow.
Yes. It always gets the excitement going and the enthusiasm and that engagement and that connection. And it's a powerful thing. And kids generally are drawn to it. So, but I'd love to kind of wrap up our conversation today with just touching on, for those listeners out there who might feel discouraged or might feel like their child's never going to reference them or it's not even possible, what words of hope would you share to those listeners?
Well, number one, it is possible. I have so many examples of children that learn the value of referencing, and so much of it is about slowing down. And getting out of that crisis mode or that negative thinking and just slowing down and thinking about opportunity, small moments of opportunity. I know ball play isn't for everyone, but it's a good way to maybe get started if your child does like to play ball, of using those transition words and just saying 1, 2, 3 and pausing until the child looks towards you or gazes at you, and then throwing the ball. So there are some very easy strategies that you can implement to start working on this. But for each child, it's different. So don't get discouraged if the first thing you try doesn't work.
Right.
Try something else. Try it again.
Could be
just
the day.
For a few minutes. It could be right. And just try for a few minutes.
Yes. I think that's kind of the most important, significant thing here is that these little moments lead to something really big. It's not that one day you're going to teach a skill and the skill all of a sudden is going to be taught and it goes from not knowing it to knowing it. These things require experience, they require time, they require patience and adjustments and really just slowing down, as you mentioned, and believing that over time, these little moments are going to lead to something really big. And we see it time and time again. And, I think it's so significant. And I'm so glad that we were able to have this conversation and share information about referencing and why it's so critical and that it can be certainly worked on and can be very successful. And it really does lead to more growth opportunities and more advancement.
Absolutely. And I think we should mention neural connectivity before we end this conversation, because that's actually the opportunity that we're giving individuals with autism, is to increase their neural connectivity. So every time you give them an opportunity to reference, and if they're able to make the discovery of, this is meaningful, you're increasing their neural connectivity. So once they have one opportunity on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, you're really giving them a chance to get to that next level, to really make discoveries that change their brain.
Absolutely. And that leads to our next part 3 in our series, which is going to be coordinating actions. So we'll be expanding on this next time. And we'll be talking about coordinating actions, and you have to reference to get to that stage. And so it's just a cool process to see kids go through and families, be the ones to create these opportunities for their children. And before we wrap up, I want to make sure to give our listeners an opportunity to find out more about where they can learn more about RDI and the services you're offering and all that good stuff.
Well, the best way to reach me is really through the Therapeutic Approach to Growth website. And that is TAG, FOR, growth, GROWTH.com. And on that website, there's more information about RDI, and there's ways to sign up for the RDI intro presentation, which I give weekly, and it's a live presentation that people can join through Zoom. And I show videos and I really give an overview of TAG's RDI program. So I'd love to have you there and share more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. If anybody's interested, that's a great way to learn more and great way to connect further with Gail. You get hands-on opportunity to ask her questions and see live, real video examples of families doing this great stuff with their children. So thank you so much for sharing that, Gail. And thank you so much for being here today. I loved this conversation. I had a great time talking about referencing and can't wait for our next topic of coordinating actions. And just thank you so much for all the work you're doing and everything you're doing for the community and your clients. I really appreciate it.
Well, and thank you so much for doing this podcast, Brooke. I can't say enough about it and how much I've learned from the podcast. And just thank you for having me for this third time to have a conversation with you. And I can't wait for the next one either.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gail. Have a great day.
I'm dancing on the edge again. The wind is calling my name. I'm dancing on the edge again. This time I'm not looking back, babe. You can change me, you can tell me down. I'll leave echoes in every place I fly. I break the molds with rebels mind. I'm a hurricane of free, born mind.
The information provided on this podcast is for general informational purposes only. The content shared is based on the experiences, opinions, and perspectives of the hosts and their guests and should not be construed as medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment recommendations. The discussions and topics covered are intended to foster understanding and awareness of autism therapies, but are not a substitute for professional medical guidance. Before making any decisions regarding therapies or treatments, we strongly encourage you to consult with a qualified healthcare provider who can provide personalized recommendations based on your unique circumstances. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge and agree that the hosts, guests, and producers are not responsible for any consequences, damages, or outcomes arising from the use or application of any information during the show.